I think it's interesting, this question of, DEI is kind of a checkbox versus something in the culture. And what we see consistently is that organizations that are more inclusive and more diverse are stronger, better performing organizations. And there's lots of research that shows that, when everybody can show up as their full selves and are in that safe place, they can thrive, and that actually helps the organizations thrive. I think, how do you think about this? Somebody mentioned disability, which is a really important piece, the diversity discussion. I think that's only recently getting more visibility, and people are, for the first time, really reminding each other that needs to be part of the discussion. But how do you think about it in terms of recruitment and retention, and the difference of just saying, like, how do we bring together a diverse group versus how do we allow people that safe space to thrive? And should we be looking to make sure we're including all of these diverse groups, and how do we think about that? So how do we when we get down to a little bit more, how organizations are being judged or thinking about themselves? I think there's some question about approach there and, what they should do. So I'd love for you all just to talk a little bit about that, and, how you contextualize all those different layers of this conversation. Victor, why don't we start with you?
Well, I'm going to repeat part of what I said earlier about being clear about objectives and co-creating them, because when you have that, then you can start examining. All right, who are we excluding that could contribute to this particular objective or goal? I was looking at an anti-racism toolkit that was created by some publishing companies as a consortium, and I was surprised myself, because the way I used to post positions before, I used to make a requirement, a certain track that privileged groups follow. Because I followed that track, even though I was not in those privileged groups, I adjusted to that, right? So in a way, myself, I was excluding those people without even knowing. But once you know what is the objective and what do these particular positions, what do they have to do to contribute to that objective, it's a little easier to then start delayering all the pieces that exclude other groups. So I would add that tidbit, and if anybody wants more information, I can send it to you later, Michael, about the anti-racism toolkit.
Yeah, that would be great. I'd love to share that with everyone. And I do think there are those patterns, right, of things we've just been doing the same way and don't realize what the impact is on those. Abby, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, like Victor said, that's a great point. Kind of, starting and looking at the language that you have in applications. So something you can do is kind of examine existing processes. The hiring process is one of those. And just kind of look and scan through and see, what do you have listed in your application that could potentially be, excluding somebody, maybe unintentionally, of course, but so you can go as far as to remove certain requirements. I've seen examples of organizations, when they're looking for someone to fill a position, they will take off the requirement of having a degree in that field. And using something like having enough experience in that field, regardless of your college education, is one way to kind of open that up further, to find someone who would be a good culture add, right, rather than culture fit to that position. So other things as well, looking at different language usage, that sort of thing, taking out terms that might come across as othering. One example I saw recently was, the word guru, right? That could be an exclusive term, depending on the context. So taking things like that out of an application. One thing that a lot of people will do as well, which it's pretty common, but you're interviewing somebody and you think, oh, would I have a beer with this person, right? That's something that a lot of people think. And that type of thinking could lead to an unintentional exclusion of that person, where, first of all, like, does everybody drink alcohol? No. So that thinking in itself is already something that could be exclusive. And again, unintentionally, but it is a really common way of thinking. So another way to look at that would be, rather than thinking, oh, can I go have a beer with this person? Think, what are this person's values, and how does this person's existing values and thoughts kind of align and contribute to our organization's existing values, right? So how can this person add more to what we already have? Don't think about it as like, this is someone I could hang out with, and that's great too, right? But, really thinking about how someone's experiences and thought processes and existing values, how they can actually contribute to your organization. And that's the best way to look at it. It'll kind of eliminate that thought of, trying to find someone who is going to fit into the mold and, see what they have to offer, right? What can they do to kind of maybe take the organization in a different direction than you were maybe even thinking about in the first place?
Yeah. Well, Juan?
Victor and Abigail said it well. What I'm going to add is coming back to the point of accountability. And so whether it's a policy or a process, how do you embed diversity, equity, and inclusion? There isn't one policy that I can't think of that I'm going to have a focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So it comes back to me in several ways. Our leaders being held accountable. So what does that look like? So at my organization, we started implementing our goals where all of us now are accountable for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it's through our performance appraisals. We don't like those performance appraisals, but it's part of the job. But it's tied to compensation. And at the end of the day, it's no different than another a metric that we would hold ourselves accountable for. We're also being more accountable to our members. As Victor shared in terms of anti-racism, yes, we put out a statement. Yes, we put out a framework for that. But now our members are saying, okay, it's been a year. Show us what you've done. Show us the outcome, the metrics. How did you measure your progress within a year? So that sometimes involves a lot of conversations. Sometimes it involves heavy data. Are we collecting the right data? So we've been looking at our data instruments to make sure that we're collecting beyond the traditional race, ethnicity, and gender. Now we're including other aspects of the data. And more important, reporting that out. Because it's one thing to collect information and collect data, but then you keep it to yourself and you don't report that out. And I think the other way we've been looking at advancing equity, diversity, and inclusion has been through our board structure. And I do this all the time. When I go to an organization, the first thing I do is go to the board and I see, what am I looking for? First of all, visual. Is it all Caucasian? How many women? How many Latinos? How many of this or that? At my organization, we just made an effort to add a new board position related to adding a young, a junior faculty member, a voice that's missing, So it's looking at the leadership and identifying what's missing. For me, a lot of the times it's missing is someone who looks like me on the board, someone who is the board president or the chief staff officer. And so I always say, when you're putting, and engaging members and you're presenting and you're even at your annual meeting, one of the quickest things that I tend to do is I line up the pictures of all my presenters. A visual tells 1,000 words. And when I want to see, I see an all-man panel. I'm like, even for us here today, I was like, we made sure, we wanted to be representative of different attributes. And so it's important, I think, many layers. Each one of them has a different touch point. Each one of them will require different resources and different time commitments. But again, I come back to, when we need help with anything, we go out, we get a vendor, or we get a consultant, we get member volunteers. And these are the same things that we have to do to further advance diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yeah, thank you, Juan. I think that your point about accountability is one to be reiterated. The idea that we've got to measure folks, we've got to make sure this is on the agenda. and that's a piece where if it's on the agenda once and then it disappears, it's not something people are going to go back to and say, what have we done and who's responsible and how do we measure that? So I think that feels like there's lots of different answers, but making sure there's some accountability for the journey feels like it's a really important piece.